Hi, this week's topic is on DIY punk and everyday struggles, and as usual, I'm going to break it up into three parts. First part, what is DIY, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of conceptual underpinnings of the broader topic. Second part will be a more empirical, research-based thing, presenting some of the research of talking to young people in the scenes about them reflecting on what they do and some of the meanings around that kind of stuff. And the third part, we're joined by Megan Sharp, who I'm going to talk with about notions of gender and sexuality and the way that that plays out in the DIY scene. So let's get into part one. So this first part of the lecture, I suppose I want to kind of ground the rest of it, and including the next week where we talk about more career-based stuff connected to the scene around youth culture. So I've gone through that a little bit in the earlier part of the course. Youth culture's been a key site where people do their leisure and creative and artistic practices, forms of consumption. So there's kind of these playoffs between, authenticity, commodification, creativity, conformity, all that kind of stuff that I've mentioned already. Resistance through rituals, all that kind of thing. So I'm looking at a scene today across the east coast of Australia. DIY scene particularly has a punk ethos that I'm going to unpack more. But yeah, so this is kind of that youth cultures thing. You'll see that what it also expresses in this work, though, is like how important the meanings of this kind of practices are to people's very being, their identity. And it crosses over next week in kind of that bridging the gap between cultures and transitions to the kind of way that, being in this scene and having a certain ethos then reflects in the way that these young people thought about their careers and jobs and stuff like that. So the scene I'm looking at, just to kind of very quickly set it up, and there's some links there for you to check out some of the music and labels and things like that. The people in it referred to it as scene, so I'm not going to get into the kind of terminology debates about subcultures, neo-tribe and scenes, in kind of aspects of all of those things that's going on here, but I'm going to stick with scene. It's across all of Australia, but I did the research in Sydney, Melbourne, Newcastle, and Sydney. So Sydney, Melbourne, Newcastle, and Brisbane. And yeah, it's a particular kind of congregation of bands that kind of play together, but there's no real sound. There's a real kind of no unifying sound, which is often the unifying thing of a particular scene. It's kind of been described in a book called The Ugly Australian Underground that we'll talk about in the third part of the lecture. It created some controversy around it, kind of focusing more on masculine and male bands. And it also developed its own genre in a way called doll wave, which is also controversial that I'll talk about in a minute. So this research was done between, I'm going to say 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, I think. And I think I was writing it up in 17 and 18. So, some of the kind of bands and links here are kind of a little bit dated now. Some of them are still going. It's kind of 10 years ago now. These people that are in their early 20s, now in their early 30s. And I'll talk about aspects of kind of the choosing poverty and of that next week. The term DIY has kind of got a long and kind of complicated history. In music, it was definitely around kind of punk scenes, kind of early 80s, punk and post-punk scenes. London and Washington and New York, all these kind of places had their own little things going, but then it spreads out, and most cities have a version of it in some way or another. Tends to be kind of congregation of like-minded people who kind of committed to working outside the kind of mainstream music industry. DIY tends to be a kind of space where people want to create together, want to have a sense of authenticity. It's not about kind of money. It's about expressing oneself, expressing your artistic integrity, and relating to other people like that. And it's also tends to be, when it works well, really community-minded. People are kind of working for and with each other. It's not particularly individual. But the term DIY as well has been kind of used a bunch of different ways. It's been used in sociology, for instance, in relation to notions of individualization, where it's up to people now to kind of create, do-it-yourself biography from an early age to live out your life, to make the right choices that, in this sense, prescriptive roles related to class, gender, race and ethnicity and stuff like that, it's argued by these guys is less constrictive today, and you're kind of enforced from an earlier age to kind of think how you can construct your own life. In Australia, Anita Harris and Josh Rouse did some great work about the idea of DIY citizenship. Young people that kind of create their own civic networks and their own forms of engagement. And this is particularly practiced by marginalized youth and second generation kind of immigrant youth who are often squeezed out of the kind of mainstream and kind of normative ways of being a citizen. In relation to kind of punk, there's a special issue that I was involved in around the idea of DIY careers that I'll go into a lot more in next week's stuff. But generally, you could say that's kind of a little bit kind of uncertain about what comes first, but like DIY is kind of very co-opted these days. I mean, it seems to be as much associated with like doing a renovation on your house or something like that. So DIY is a term that means very different things across different spectrums and different fields or whatever. But here we're talking about the kind of punk and DIY career versions of it. So Ware wrote a book about kind of different forms of DIY relating to that stuff. And I won't go into this slide in too much detail. You can read it. But like they argued that there was like DIY individualists that kind of act on their own inclinations and do stuff by themselves, DIY coordinators that might kind of work with others and share this kind of stuff, and DIY lifestylers that kind of, invest themselves completely into this kind of thing. So I'd say the young people that I'm about to talk about in the research are a mix between the coordinator and lifestyle, but I wouldn't really categorize them as such. But like DIY is definitely a kind of key motivator for their orientation towards their creative practices, but also to kind of, more broader lifestyle. So I'm also using it then also in terms of the DIY biography because, in the sense they're creating this stuff, but here DIY is much about this kind of punk ethos, specific cultural, political, and ethical values that are drawn upon to make decisions about work and careers alongside their creative practices as well. And this often leads them to kind of accepting being relatively poor for the rest of their lives. I don't really want a part of the rat race, not trying to build a kind of career and, earn $1 million or whatever. It also relates, I think, to Bourdieu's notion of illusio. So kind of in terms of the sociological theory that's kind of underpinning this, and I go into this in the book, Youth Class and Everyday Struggles in quite some detail. The kind of commitment to punk and DIY can be thought of as this notion of illusio, this idea where illusio is the idea of like how we invest ourselves in particular practices and the meaning around them. So in specific fields that Bourdieu talks about, say education or politics or consumption, there's kind of various purposes and rewards for kind of doing that stuff well and like investing yourself in it. So, the illusio of higher education, for instance, would be, you go invest yourself in it in a way to kind of get you the qualifications to have a better job and a better life, more money, more opportunities. So the illusio there is if you invest yourself in it, this will have some kind of payoff and rewards in the future. In terms of the punk illusio, the illusio is kind of dedicating yourself to a particular ethic, a particular kind of non-capitalist ethic as much as possible, as realistically possible, and having a kind of ethic about authenticity and making decisions along those lines. So using another kind of Borgesian term, social gravity, there's a kind of as Ghassan Haj puts it, there's nothing other than is like this force of experience of moving along your life and exerting yourself and your kind of intense investment in things on other people and on other purposes. So what this means is that there's a kind of playoff between this notion of illusio, investing yourself in things, and social gravity. As you invest in something more and more throughout your life, it becomes more and more about who you are. So you can think about this, if you're spent your life trying, being a teacher, and the illusio of that would be something like, not only having a relatively secure job, but like, helping kids and, making the next generation or whatever. Once you invest yourself in that, it becomes part of your identity as well. Becomes part of how you think about the world, about how you want the world to be. So the investment in the rewards of that also becomes quite gravitas in the sense that it's important, you're attracted to it, but but it also takes on this kind of gravitas in the sense that it becomes really more important to you. It becomes really serious. So gravity in that has a double meaning. And so you can, what I'm kind of getting to here is that for people that invest themselves into the DIY scene, there's different levels of investment by different people. And people can invest themselves into it. So it's kind of their whole lives, or others may invest themselves in it in the sense that they go to gigs on the weekend and that's about it. And so there's different kind of levels of commitment to this thing. For the people I spoke about to in this research, I would say they were mostly quite seriously invested in it. The punk ethos has become a kind of way of life in many respects at different levels for different people. And it could be for some of them now, you know, almost 10 years later, that it's not a thing for them anymore. And I think it is for some of them. Others I know, you know, have kind of started to have family and kids, but they're still kind of living with this kind of punk ethos. So in this sense, we can see punk as an illusio, this DIY illusio. And the elements of that are things like reflexively pursuing values and ethics that don't comply with kind of normative consumerist demands, broad commitments to attitude, ethics, and aesthetics that align with the notion of DIY, and creating alternative spaces, not just physical spaces, but like kind of creative spaces where people can work outside of this mainstream, foster autonomous relations and creativity, build networks, stuff like that. So as I said, it's not just about creative and artistic stuff. It can be used about career and life goals. And once you kind of come invested into this thing, it starts to color the way other kind of things are kind of are viewed, I suppose. And so in the third part this week, we'll kind of problematize the punk illusio in a way that's kind of meant to be outside the normative and challenging and resisting normative things, and show how, like, even in spaces like that, a lot of normative kind of inequalities still exist, particularly around gender and sexuality. Okay, I'll leave this kind of introductory conceptual part there and move on in part two to some more empirical research-based discussion.